You can access the poll by looking on your toolbar. You should have a poll option there. Awesome. So go ahead and take some time to answer those questions in the poll. In the meantime, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today for our webinars. This is another presentation of many. And if you would like to join us next Saturday, we will also be having some more great speakers. My name is Shayla Gutierrez. I'm the Garden Program Coordinator at Green Venture. And I'm joined today by Shiyun, our youth volunteer, who will be monitoring the chat room. Hi. We have a few housekeeping items for those of you who may just be joining us today for the first presentation. Mics are turned off just to ensure the quality of sound for our presentation today and for our speaker. We are recording today's session and it will be available for you to access at a later date. Throughout the session, we encourage you to use the chat box for any questions to be answered at the end of the presentation. And if for some reason we get disconnected today, you'll be placed into the waiting room and we'll be right back shortly. Today, we are joined by Stefan Weber. Stefan is a wild seed expert with a PhD in restoration ecology from McMaster University. He works as a community ecologist with Carolinian Canada and is the founder of the Ontario Plant Restoration Alliance. I'm going to stop my screen share now and let you take it away, Stefan. In the meantime, go ahead and answer those questions in the poll. So far, it looks like most of our audience has some intermediate experience in growing native plants from seed. 67% do not know which local wild populations their garden plants are derived from. And the third question is, are you tracking your garden conservation impact? 63% of our audience says no, while 36% says yes. The fourth question is, are you interested in gathering wild seeds and or farming native plant seeds? Looks like 94% are interested.
Awesome. I hope that you are interested, and that's why you've joined us today. So thank you so much, Sheila, and to Green Venture and CD Saturday for hosting. These are wonderful events. I'm going to talk about seed really kind of generally today, but talk around issues relating to seed supply, seed conservation, seed collection, and then we'll talk about some hands-on things that you can do to get your own seed orchard garden started. So I am speaking today on behalf of a couple different organizations, actually, but primarily the Ontario Plant Restoration Alliance, and we are a volunteer-led grassroots organization that started in Hamilton with a Hamilton seed strategy, and we've slowly evolved over the last few years and are now starting to plant seed conservation orchards in the region with plants that were collected from local remnant wild populations. So a few years ago, we were one of the first organizations to conduct research on the native plant economy in Southern Ontario, and we did that with the Hamilton Naturalist Club. The photos that you just saw were some of our work this past year. We partnered with Coots to Escarpment and Carolinian Canada to plant a seed orchard in Halton. We've also partnered with Environment Hamilton on a number of workshops and are planning a number of orchards within the Greenbelt, including the Hamilton region, this coming spring. So that's just a summary of some of the stuff that we're up to let you know what kind of organization that we are. And one of the things that we deal with is the issue of supplying ethically sourced and ecologically appropriate native plants to restoration projects. There is an industry in Ontario. There are not-for-profits that do some of this work, but there is so much on the ground grassroots conservation and seed saving that needs to be done. We are trying to address some of those gaps. So this is the decade on ecosystem restoration, the United Nations decade. And so, all levels of government and individuals and organizations are encouraged to do what they can to restore local, healthy, functioning ecosystems. But the question is, where do those ecosystems come from, and how do we ensure that our restored ecosystems reflect a biodiversity of a healthy ecosystem? So here in southwestern Ontario, we are in the most populated region of Canada. We're also in the most biodiverse region of Canada, and it's a highly fragmented and environmentally degraded region because of direct impacts of colonialism on the land. And so in order to advance our conservation and restoration work, we really do promote and support Indigenous-led restoration and rematriation of plants and seeds in the spirit and practice of truth and reconciliation. And this in part means acknowledging that habitat comprised of native plants, which we've lost on the landscape, continues to be destroyed through colonialism and acts of colonization. So conservation of native plants requires that we uphold Indigenous land sovereignty and seed sovereignty, and also recognize that when we fragment healthy populations, we're really robbing them of their autonomy as individuals, as species on the landscape, and we reduce their potential to regenerate themselves. And this is done violently. And to give back to these plants and to be truly reciprocal with the plants and the communities and ecosystems that sustain us, it means giving back to them, giving space back, giving our time, our consideration, our love, our efforts, our energy. So moving forward, we're trying to rebuild ecosystems with plants, because plants are the foundation of all terrestrial ecosystems. All life on Earth depends on plants in some way, native plants in some way, either directly or indirectly as habitat, as food. So they form intricate relationships with all life on Earth, including insects. This is a turtlehead plant. It can only be pollinated by large bees, native bees, bumblebees, things like that. It's also the host plant for a rare butterfly, the Baltimore checker spot. So these three species are intertwined, and this is how communities are built and relationships are built. And this is why seed conservation and plant conservation is so important. And this kind of mutualism and this relationship between plants and everything else is echoed across the animal kingdom, across different communities. There are bees that are specialists on certain plants that can only feed their young the pollen of those plants. And of course, those insects are the foundation of a much larger food chain. Birds, animals, mammals. If you're not in love with plants, if you're not persuaded to conserve plants, when you conserve them, you're conserving the birds. And who doesn't love songbirds, right? So it's really about taking an ecosystem approach to conservation and realizing that all future habitats will come from existing habitats, and all terrestrial habitats will be dominated by plants, hopefully native plants, local origin. And so I spent the last few years actually studying seed-based restoration ecology at McMaster University. And I'm just going to give you a really quick case study of how native plants and seed-based restoration work contributes to biodiversity. And I spent a lot of time at the roadside, and people often forget that, roads are corridors for wildlife as well, including pollinators, including wildflowers. So we partnered with the Ministry of Transportation and studied revegetation on the roadside using native plants and seeds. And here's just kind of a satellite image of our plots where we planted native mixes, and we had control plots nearby where we didn't plant native mixes. And we studied those plots for 3 years. not only how they were created, but what were the overall effects on the community after we created them. And this is the only graph I swear I'm going to show you, but it demonstrates between the restored and the controlled plots that the restored plots over 3 years had more than twice, sometimes 4 times as many bees, native bees, and these are the different genera listed out. But returning those native plants to the environment did support a broader diversity and abundance of bees. One cool thing that we saw, which is evident of a healthy, diverse bee community, is we found bee parasites. These are bees themselves, but they plant their eggs, lay their eggs in the nests of other bees, like a cuckoo. And in order for us to, detect a population of this bee, it would need a really healthy population or diversity and abundance of other native bees. So that was a really amazing indicator that adding native plants really does have an impact on biodiversity. So I assume you've heard some of this before, and you understand this, and you're really passionate about restoring the landscape. And the question remains, where is all of this plant material going to come from? How are we going to produce it and collect it in a way that's ethical, that's equitable, and that's sustainable, And this is just one photo of a large restoration project I was involved in. That's about 1 metric ton of acorns and hickories and plum pits. And this is just a fraction of the amount of seed that's needed to restore our highly fragmented landscape in southwestern Ontario. And how do we do that in a way that isn't, overly extractive? And so we've developed over time conversations and partnerships with a number of organizations, and we are now working towards and aligned around a Southern Ontario seed strategy, which will bring collective action to some of these priorities in terms of seed conservation and restoration. So I'm not going to go through all of the organizations, but here are some of our aims as a collective. We want to engage people in restoration through horticulture, through developing relationships with plants, growing plants. We want to conserve their wild populations. We want to, protect those as high quality seed sources. And this is all in order to accelerate habitat restoration, as I've spoken to. We want to do this while supporting Indigenous-led restoration. We want to promote investment in biodiversity as an ecological good and service. This is kind of going back to the first point, highlighting that human-plant interaction. We've been growing plants for their seed to eat and for other reasons for thousands of years, many generations across the world. And so in many ways, growing seeds is what we do really well as people. So, and then, technically we want to create some standards and some guidelines for the production and tracking of seed sources. So we do want to understand where our native plants and seeds are coming from so that we are better informed when we're putting them back out on the landscape, particularly in light of climate change. We also want to be able to maintain chain of custody, who has previously grown those plants, who has used them in a restoration, where do they come from, what other populations have they mixed with in their restoration, etc. We want to make sure that access to this information is accessible, and we also want to make sure that we're not over harvesting, so we can keep track of where people are on the landscape and which populations are being collected from. There's also standards around maintaining genetic diversity. So if you're collecting from the same 3 or 4 plants from your garden every year, that's great if you're a hobbyist and growing plants for yourself and some friends. But if we're talking about rebuilding ecosystems from the ground up, we need genetically diverse plant material, which means a lot of intervention and sometimes bringing together of fragmented populations. And that all requires tracking, research, monitoring. So this is just some of the work that needs to go into conserving native plant and seed sources on the landscape. It's not as simple as everybody going out and collecting from the wild and planting as many as we can. It really has to be done in a coordinated way. And so one way that we're trying to support this is encouraging people to plant a seed conservation orchard. And this can be many things. It can look like a farm. It can look like a traditional vegetable garden. It can also look like sustainable management of an existing wild population that you occasionally collect from with a purpose. And so what makes it an orchard? Well, the population is healthy. You know, we're talking a large number of plants to maintain genetic diversity. The plants are tended to in some way, weeded, watered, if necessary. The planting and the orchards are really meant to address local species-specific threats, either addressing rare or uncommon plants, or there's maybe a need for grassland restoration in a region, and so you need a whole bunch of seeds for grassland plants. And one of the principles is that you would need to maintain these spaces so that it's easy to collect seed from, and that you would be getting the most seed out of the least amount of area, so that the plants are most efficient and making as much seed as possible, basically as happy and reproductive as you can get them. And this can contribute back to restoration in all kinds of different ways, but this is really just the only real way that we could increase our capacity to do restoration work on the landscape. So there are certainly nurseries and industries that are involved in this commercially, but I think that everybody has a role to play in your own garden and also in public spaces. So we're working with some of the organizations that I listed before. Here is just a quick kind of visual overview of what it takes to create a seed orchard. Collect seed from fragmented populations, scale it up using traditional horticultural practices, plant that out in a way that can be managed and can contribute to restoration initiatives. So this is just some of the work that I did a few years back with the St. William's Nursery and Conservation Center. They are the largest native seed producer in Ontario at the moment, wildflower seed producer in Ontario. And I learned a lot about growing native plants and scaling them up for ecologically appropriate seed. And they really are spectacular spaces. And they are not only production spaces and farms, they're also habitat themselves. It's 100 acres of locally sourced wildflowers, which is amazing habitat throughout the year. And also potentially amazing community spaces, educational spaces. You can learn about ecology, reciprocity, seed collection. You can learn about insect identification. Imagine doing an art course out here. Imagine, attending a concert in this kind of space. So there's a lot of additional benefits or co-benefits or other good things that go along with focusing on seed and putting native seed collection and production at the heart of restoration. And one of those co-benefits is food. We can eat many of these plants. A lot of them are culturally important plants for First Nations, and creating orchards creates food and seed, which contributes to restoration. So lots of different co-benefits and opportunities to grow. So I'm going to shift a little bit and get a little bit more practical, but before I do, I want to talk a little bit about some of the plants that the Ontario Plant Restoration Alliance focuses on. And I think this is important because a lot of these plants are maybe not well known, and it's important that they get a spotlight for a minute and that their story is shared. So we do, plant seed orchards in order to collect lots of seed and distribute seed to the community, but we also grow some of the regionally uncommon plants within our network of volunteers, so that we have seed sources that are not wild seed sources, so that we don't have to go back to the wild repeatedly to collect seed for restoration. So this is one of the kind of more fun species we're working on. It's the wood betony, and it is a hemiparasite, which means it's mostly parasitic, and it will parasitize native grasses and a variety of other wildflowers, but mostly grasses and sedges. Here we have it growing with a woodland sedge. And these seeds were collected from 2 or 3 plants in a very fragmented population, and we have about 30 of them now in a garden. Here is a much larger population at a site in Niagara, a beautiful plant when it flowers, but again, it needs a healthy host community in order to flourish. So it's a bit tricky to restore. Here's one of the easier plants to grow that we work with. It's the giant yellow hyssop. It is found in the Hamilton region. It's uncommon. Have a look for it along the escarpment forest edges. It's a very tall, almost looks like a candelabra, like a person standing up straight with their arms out, and covered in little yellow flowers and bees through the late summer. So this is another easy to grow plant. However, it's a biennial plant. So, unless seeds can germinate every year, every other year, populations of this plant can easily disappear, and it can easily disappear in a garden. So it takes a bit more intervention to keep around, unless it's really happy and it seeds on its own. But it's the biennial gara, or bee blossom. We work with a couple different goldenrods. This is my favorite. It's a small white flowered goldenrod found in the forest called silver rod. A lot of the plants we work with are actually tiny little wispy things because they're not rare enough to be protected, and they're not pretty and fabulous enough to be grown in the garden. This one can be appreciated in a rock garden setting, and people do grow this, and you can find it in the nursery trade, but it's less common. It's the slender vervain, very tiny. This is our North American native crabapple. And you can tell it's a native crabapple because it has slightly lobed, slightly maple-shaped leaves and pink flowers that smell amazing. We work with a couple of milkweeds, including poke milkweed, world milkweed. So the population in Norfolk County of world milkweed is, as far as we can tell, down to 1 plant that actually flowered this year. There are a couple others that didn't. Nearby is the green milkweed. Again, the roadside population of this plant was not really being monitored or protected. It was being accidentally mowed down every few years. And so we've collected seed now a few times, and we have a whole bunch of seedlings ready to go into seed orchards. This is a fun plant that we're working with mostly for aesthetic reasons, to be honest with you. It has a limited range in the southwest of Ontario, but it's very easy to grow. It's very attractive. It's called a seed box. So some of these seeds we do have available. If you're really keen, you can reach out to me and get your hands on them that way. The best way is probably to wait until we have a seedling sale later, and then you can adopt some of them into your garden. So I'm going to talk about legumes for a few minutes because legumes make the world go round, and I think a focus of the seed strategy in Hamilton and hopefully in Southern Ontario should be on legumes, native legumes. We work with a few different types. This plant, there's only one population with 1 plant in all of the Niagara region. Historically, it was widespread in pine oak kind of upland forest. This is the wild blue lupin. We don't work directly with it now as Ontario Plant Restoration Alliance, but in the past I did a lot of work with this plant. And It's really a seed-based restoration success story. The wild population had been reduced to, a few dozen patches. And because it's a legume, because it's a bean, it germinates so readily. A few seeds were collected, scaled up really quickly, and basically every seed germinates. So now there are acres of blue lupin restored in Norfolk County. Primarily work done by the Nature Conservancy, but also the local conservation authority and land trust and others. There are all kinds of legumes. Keep your eye out. This is a pretty common one, but nobody grows it. It's a great annual for containers. It's a trailing plant. It's called the beach bean. This is another annual native legume, the beach pea, which would be an amazing annual plant in hanging baskets, things like that. This is a rare wood pea that we've just kind of rediscovered the population. So we haven't actually collected seed for these things yet. Population monitoring is step one for some of the rare stuff, including the wood vetch. So all of these plants, they are rare, but they are not rare enough to be protected by any legislation or protected by any official government recovery strategy. So we work with local conservation experts to find the populations first, monitor them, and when the time is appropriate, potentially collect seed. This is one of the populations of green dragon in Niagara. And of course, green dragon is kind of the bigger, badder cousin of Jack in the pulpit. A pretty common plant that's actually easy to grow, and so is green dragon. So I guess that's my not too smooth segue into the part where we talk about seed propagation a little bit. And I really like doing this stuff in a hands-on workshop, and it's too bad that we can't meet in person. But I do thank CD Saturday and Green Venture and everyone for going through with these virtual talks. So I'm just going to walk you through a bunch of stuff and then throw you a bunch of references. We'll start with tools. The things in white at the top are basic. You can do 10, 20, 30 different species with just those tools. You may want some more advanced tools if you're looking at producing a lot of seed, or if you're dealing with some of the trickier species. And I'll get to that in just a second. Actually, I'll go back there. Yeah, I do a lot of seed cleaning with a shop vac. It's really handy for milkweeds, and a leaf mulcher, which is really handy for bush clover and desmodiums and things that need to be broken up a little bit. So first step is get some basic tools, okay? So most of you have those things. And then it comes time to collect. A few rules, I would say, best practices for collection. Don't collect seed before it's ripe. Make sure that you look at some of the seed, use nail clippers, use a small knife, be careful, bite it open, but make sure you've checked some of those seeds, because you can waste a lot of time collecting bad seed. Store most things, including berries, at room temperature for a couple days. Don't put it immediately into the fridge. Also, don't leave it in your car. If it's the summer, they are baby plants wrapped up inside of that seed, and they will overheat and die. So a lot of seed needs to be kind of like rubbed and screened, and it needs to be dry first for you to do that. So make sure your seed is nice and dry, lay it out, make sure it doesn't mold in the process, things like that. So if you need to wait a few months, what do you do with your seed? Keep it in a paper bag in your fridge, dry, cold, a couple degrees is best. If it's very dry, you could leave it out at room temperature. This goes for most seeds. Every species is a little bit different. And also keep in mind, when you are stratifying your seeds, you can't keep them in stratification indefinitely. Many of them have a specific period, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, that they need to be stratified. So you need to have a bit of a schedule in terms of when you're going to do each of these things with your seed. So it is winter, but there are still things that you can collect in the Hamilton region when you are out and about, and it's probably best to make sure you have permission to do this, but all of these are common species, and if you're collecting less than 10% of them, you should be fine. You might stumble upon some brown-eyed Susan at this time of year, really distinct dark brown round little heads, and the seed will be tucked inside. So pick those, let them thaw out, let them dry, and then crush them. So you can also collect bergamot at this time of year. It's very obvious along the trails. Don't pick too much. Each of those heads is full of little seeds. Again, pick them, let them thaw out, dry, and then you can screen them. If you're along a creek or a bit of a wetter area, you might stumble upon some blue vervain. And they're pretty obvious. They'll be kind of tall, dark brown fingers sticking out of the bush, and they will have very distinct kind of flattened oblong seeds. One side of the seed is sort of silver, the other side of the seed is sort of brown. And if you're not in a wet area and you see this, it might be a different species, the white vervain. So feel free to email me if you'd like any of this information. I can send it to you. This is, we talked about this earlier, it's an uncommon plant found in Hamilton along the escarpment. Do note, if you find it and collect a bit of seed, it grows very easily. So all of these things are easy to grow. They don't require much effort, but this one grows like wildfire. And it's pretty easy to identify even in the winter. The dried parts will smell kind of minty licorice. It's a tall plant with a big square stem and dark brown seeds. So I mentioned stratification earlier, and I guess I'll backtrack a little bit. If you've never heard that term, stratification just means a period that the seeds need to be cold and moist in order to break their dormancy, in order to convince them that it's spring and it's time to germinate. And this kind of is like a way to replicate winter in nature. And you can do this by winter sowing and sowing your seeds in the fall, leaving them out covered, protected from the squirrels, but outside in the winter, and they will stratify naturally. You can also do this kind of in an accelerated way in your refrigerator. And because the seeds are being held at a constant temperature rather than going really low and freezing and then coming back up, they need less time, but that means that you need to watch them. You can over stratify. So cold moist stratification is just giving your seeds a period of cold moist conditions. And every species is different. There's a wonderful website created by Crystal Wallach from Ottawa, Kingston area, wildplantsfromseed.com, and this includes all kinds of native plants from Southern Ontario as well as elsewhere in Eastern North America. And I would refer to that website, frankly, over referring to my slides if you're looking for really amazing detailed information on this kind of stuff. But if you're looking for a few species to start because they are really easy, I would look to things like brown-eyed Susan, wild bergamot, which you can collect this time of year maybe. Try wild columbine. The different beard tongues are also really easy. And again, yellow hyssop. Those are easy because they really don't need much stratification at all, a couple days. If you have time and space in your fridge or you want to winter sow, you can consider, milkweeds, mountain mints, asters, and goldenrods. Those are all perfectly easy to do if you have a bit of time to stratify them. So other things, including a lot of shrubs, a lot of fleshy, fruited berry, trees and bushes, as well as understory plants, spring ephemerals, those are more difficult. So they need either longer stratification periods, or they need a period of warm stratification, or they need something called scarification, which is a physical breaking down of the seed coat to let them take in water. So sometimes they need to be soaked in acid, or they need a hot water bath, or they need to be filed down. So these are more difficult species. Again, check out Crystal's website. A lot of great information there. So I have about 10 minutes and then I'm going to take questions, I think. A few tips as you're going through that cold moist stratification process. You will need, a Ziploc or a plastic container that's airtight. You'll need some growing medium, either a peat-based kind of potting soil. You can use paper towel or something like vermiculite if you're a hort pro. And a refrigerator. You can do this in a cold shed over the winter too, but controlling the temperature is easier with a fridge. So start by moistening your growing medium and then squeezing out all of the excess moisture. So nothing's dripping out of it, but it's still damp to the touch. Because those seeds can drown, right? So you want to give them moisture, but not too much moisture. Add your seeds. Roughly, I don't know, like a 1-to-1 kind of volume of seed to medium, maybe a little bit more of the medium, and just shake that around gently, distribute the seeds evenly, and put it in the fridge for the period of time that it needs. And then when you are ready to sow them, it's one of the easier ways to do it is just bring it out in the spring. So you have to time it to approximately April 1st. So actually I start most of my stratification in late February to early March, and it goes out in April. But if you have a different timeline, that's cool too. And if you bring them directly out, sow them very shallowly, less than a 1/4 inch or right on the surface. And I would protect them from squirrels and other curious things. So hopefully that will get you through some of the basics of starting seeds. And I just want to give you some native plant gardening references now that you can use to base some of your seed collection and propagation around. So definitely look local. Go to your local conservation areas, take notes, learn how to identify plants, and find conditions that are similar to your garden and note the native plants that are growing in those conditions. Like soil texture, clay, sand, moisture levels, shade, light. Take note of all of those things, and that becomes your reference community. And these are posted on the Ontario Plant Restoration Alliance website, so you can refer to them there if you'd like. Here's a reference for 16 Mile Creek in Oakville. You could do a similar one for anywhere in Hamilton. Also, definitely refer to this list of Carolinian plants by county, written by Mike Oldham in partnership with Carolinian Canada. It outlines every species, native and non-native, which county they're found in, and also tells you if they're rare, uncommon, etc. So cross-reference your planting list with this amazing reference and just explore. We have a few different planting palettes posted so that you can get visuals on the size and color and shapes of some of these plants, some of their growing needs. So check out our gardening guides. Here are some sample garden combinations that we recommend with easy to grow plants. And we are one of many organizations that's promoting native plant gardening. So there's no limit to the amount of gardening guides that are out there. These are just some that we have on our website I'm showing you, but definitely also check out In the Zone Gardens, which is a program with Carolinian Canada and the World Wildlife Fund. And this provides all kinds of information on native plant gardening, native plant garden and reference guides, but it also includes a couple programs, including a garden tracker program. And so you can log your garden with us. You can basically explain your conservation impact with us by showing how many native plants you're planting, what you're doing to reduce water use, those kinds of things. It's also a great way to identify if you're interested in digging in, which means participating in one or several of the different programs that Carolinian Canada has to support in the zone growers. This includes our Pawpaw Parade every year, a seed orchard program. And if you'd like to participate in some of those things, you can let us know through the tracker. Let us know how much space you have, what you're interested in doing, what you're already doing. We're currently tracking over 5,500 projects in southwestern Ontario. Much of this is private land, and this kind of conservation work is not really being noted anywhere, and it's really amazing the amount of space that's being gardened for wildlife in this way. So there's also a plant tag program as part of In the Zone, which helps folks distinguish between locally sourced, ethically grown, truly native Ontario plants and those that are masquerading as native plants, plants that are either native ecovars or they're imported from faraway places in the United States, for example, or they're species that aren't even found in Ontario at all. And so be aware that there are a lot of companies that are trying to benefit from people's interest in growing native plants and habitats, but they may not always be doing that in an authentic way. So the In the Zone program really helps to distinguish that, and we promote growers within the Ontario Native Plant Growers Association. So a couple things also you want to check out, which are sort of fun. Carolinian Canada has seed kits available on their Shopify shop. So if you want to get your hands on some of the species that I talked about today, they are available through the Carolinian Canada website. Also want to let you know about a art fundraiser that the Ontario Plant Restoration Alliance is holding now until Valentine's Day, February 14th. So check out our social media and check out our GoFundMe page. And I'm going to wrap up because I know you'll have lots of questions and I need a sip of water. So thank you so much for tuning in. Yeah, cheers.
That was great, Stefan. There is definitely a lot of questions that came into the chat. One of the last questions that came in was about how citizens can get involved in this, and I think you answered that a little bit. So for those of you who want to keep track of these resources, I will be providing a follow-up email with these resources that Stefan has provided and the link to the recording of this presentation. So if you missed anything on there, you'll be able to watch that again. So getting into the questions, one of the first questions that came in is, should milkweed or common or swamped milkweed be planted in the garden, or is it invasive? And I think someone in the chat mentioned something about that.
Sure, they're both fine in a garden. If you're planting common milkweed, it does need a lot of space. They're certainly not invasive. This is where they belong, and they can be robust. They can be large plants, so plan for the mature size of the plant and make sure, not just milkweed, any plant, you know whether it's going to spread because some plants stay in tidy clumps, some spread. Common milkweed spreads, swamp milkweed does not. It stays in a pretty tidy clump, but it does get tall. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you briefly mentioned that you will be having a seedling sale. Do you have any more information about that?
It'll be in the spring and early summer, perhaps. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, more to come.
Great. And then you spoke on some great native legumes. Are any of these native legumes edible?
I can't speak to that. That's not really my area of expertise. I know some of them, but they make very small seeds, and they actually don't make a lot of seeds. So um, the one native legume that pops to mind that's very edible, it's not the bean, it's not the seed itself that is eaten, it's the root, it's the tuber of the plant. So yeah, some of them are edible. It's a longer conversation though.
Great. And do you have any suggestions of aggressive shade-friendly native plants? Jessica Peter says she has a goal of pulling out competing periwinkle in the backyard. So she's looking for some suggestions there.
Sure. I would go to something like a woodland sunflower because they spread and they like dry shade. Also consider something like a wild ginger, which is lower, more of a ground cover, but it will spread pretty aggressively. Any of the false Solomon seals, also kind of mid-size, but robust. Those are a couple good options. Oh, woodland sunflower. Like if you've, controlled a lot of your periwinkle and you're just looking to fill the space really quickly with something that'll kind of form a barrier, woodland sunflower is a great semi-shade ground cover.
Great. And then does blue vervain need light to germinate?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, yes. Yes. Direct light is best. If you're growing indoors or something, put it really close to the grow light. That's why I recommended starting everything outside, because a lot of the meadow plants need direct sun, a lot of sun to germinate. Otherwise, they get really leggy and unhealthy.
Great. And that kind of ties into one of the questions here about any experience that you might have with mini greenhouse outdoors and kind of like that winter sowing method of placing in plastic jugs outside.
Yeah, I've definitely used the transparent plastic bin method. Um, it's pretty no nonsense. It takes up a little bit of space, but it's space that I would use anyway once the plants are grown out. So it was an okay method. Um, for the I have a small amount of a lot of different species that I grow, so I find it's more efficient to do my stratification in the fridge. And but yeah, the bin has worked for me in the past. I've used um, I use outdoor sowing for those really tricky species that I mentioned before. So a lot of woody plants, some spring ephemerals. And when I collect the seed, I clean it right away. I put it, into a pot and sow it right away, and I leave that outside. So yes.
Yeah. And we do have a webinar later on today from Halton Master Gardeners talking more about winter sowing. So tune in for that. And we're just going to take a few more questions. So is there a general rule for checking seed viability before stratifying, like the float test? And also, can you clarify if we can collect seed in the winter now, or are they less viable than seeds collected in fall and stored properly?
Sure, I'll answer the second part first. No, you can collect them now. They are totally adapted to going through winter. So the species that I mentioned, the brown-eyed Susan and the bergamot, you can collect those now as you find them. However, generally, when you're checking viability, you want to look for firm, usually pale colored insides of the seed, whether it's a big acorn or a small, tiny little brown-eyed Susan seed. Cut it open. Nail clippers are really, really handy when dealing with wildflower seeds, and just have a look. It should look firm. It should look slightly glossy, but a pale, firm surface. If you see hollow cavities, bumps, dark bits, that's probably a dead, rotted seed.
Great. And then some more questions about the giant yellow hyssop. Is it hybridized with the giant purple hyssop?
I believe it can hybridize. And in addition to that, it's also known to have a purple form. And so like 1 in a million or whatever, 1 in many thousand are kind of a purple color rather than a yellow color. They are closely related, like from an evolutionary perspective. So yes, they probably can hybridize. I would put money on it.
Okay, and then the last question, what would you suggest as an alternative to peat?
Like fine, mature compost, leaf and grass based compost, but like mature meaning it's been composted for a while and it's been screened. Yes, I know that there are like recycled paper alternatives, and I think they're pretty good for starting seed. I have yet to break my dependency on peat-based potting mix and seed starting mix. So I wish I had a better answer, actually, frankly. Sorry.
Wonderful. So that's it for questions. There was a few questions that we weren't able to get to, but I will provide those to Stefan. And if he has the time to answer those questions, he will definitely do so. Again, his contact information is on this slide, so you can feel free to contact him. There will be a follow-up email, as I said, with follow-up resources that were provided and the link to the recording for this presentation. Thank you all for joining us. And I hope you are enjoying today's Hamilton City Saturday presentation.